$10 million in unmarked, untraceable funds. That is the staggering bounty resting in an encrypted offshore account, waiting for whoever can identify a complete ghost. She isn't an assassin or a rival kingpin. She is a nurse. And a decade ago, she saved the underworld's most untouchable monster. The emergency room at Bellevue Hospital on First Avenue was a battleground on the best of nights, but the early hours of the 12th of November 2016 felt like a descent into a specialized kind of hell. A relentless nor'easter was battering New York City, flooding the FDR Drive, and overwhelming the city's emergency services. In Trauma Bay 3, Naomi Jefferson was practically running on fumes and black coffee. A brilliant, fiercely dedicated black woman in her late 20s, Naomi had earned a reputation among the medical staff as the steady anchor in the chaotic storm of the ER. She had seen everything from gang violence to catastrophic subway accidents, but nothing could have prepared her for the bloody arrival of Vincent Reynolds. Vincent was an anomaly in the city's criminal hierarchy. A ruthless syndicate boss of Korean descent who had forcefully adopted a strictly Western moniker to sever ties with his past, he ruled the city's underground gambling and extortion rings with an iron, unforgiving fist. To the NYPD, he was a phantom. To his rivals, he was the Grim Reaper in a tailored suit. But when the back door of the ambulance bay was kicked open at 3:14 a.m., he didn't look like a kingpin. He looked like a corpse. Two men in torn, blood-soaked overcoats dragged him into the corridor, dropping him violently onto a gurney before pulling firearms on the triage security guard. "Fix him," one of the men barked, his face obscured by a soaked fedora. "Or we burn this entire ward to the ground." Before anyone could hit the panic button, the two men vanished back into the freezing rain, leaving Vincent bleeding heavily onto the linoleum floor. Naomi didn't freeze. While the rest of the staff hesitated, paralyzed by the sudden display of artillery, she sprinted toward the gurney. "Get Dr. Collins down here now. Call a massive transfusion protocol. O negative, fast," she yelled, her voice cutting through the panic. Vincent was a mess. He had taken 3 hollow point rounds, one to the right shoulder, one grazing his rib cage, and a critical hit to his lower abdomen that was causing massive internal hemorrhaging. As Naomi cut away his ruined $3,000 suit jacket, his hands suddenly shot up, gripping her wrist with a terrifying, vice-like strength. His eyes snapped open. They were pitch black, sharp, and entirely devoid of fear. "No cops," he rasped, coughing up a fine mist of blood. "No names. Sir, you are bleeding out. If you don't let me work, you are going to die right here on this gurney," Naomi said, locking eyes with him. She didn't flinch. She pulled his hand away and immediately began applying direct pressure to the abdominal wound. Before Dr. Mitchell Collins could even arrive, the hospital's emergency PA system crackled to life with a terrifying announcement. Code Silver. Active shooter. The hit squad that had ambushed Vincent downtown hadn't finished the job, and they had tracked him to Bellevue. Gunfire echoed from the main lobby, the sharp, percussive cracks of automatic weapons drowning out the howling storm outside. Panic erupted. Doctors and nurses scrambled for cover. Standard protocol dictated abandoning the patient to secure oneself in a locked room. But Naomi looked down at the man on the gurney. He was losing consciousness, his skin turning an ashen gray. If she left him, he would bleed to death in less than 5 minutes. If she stayed, the gunman would execute them both. Making a split-second, irrational decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire life, Naomi unlocked the wheels of the gurney. "Hold on," she whispered. Using her intimate knowledge of Bellevue's sprawling, historic architecture, she shoved the gurney down a dark, restricted service corridor. She bypassed the modern elevators and forced the heavy doors of a freight lift open, taking them down into the hospital's decommissioned subterranean levels, a labyrinth of old psychiatric wards and storage units that hadn't seen patients since the 1980s. In a dusty, abandoned triage room, illuminated only by the emergency backup lights, Naomi essentially performed a miracle. With only the contents of a stolen trauma jump bag, she established 2 large-bore IVs, pushing saline and the 2 units of O-negative blood she had snatched from the fridge. She packed his abdominal wound with quick-clot combat gauze, applying brutal, agonizing pressure to stop the severed artery from draining the life out of him. Vincent remained conscious just long enough to watch her work. He studied her face, the intense concentration, the sweat beading on her forehead, the dark curls escaping her scrub cap. Why? He whispered, his voice barely a breath. You don't know me. I know you're a human being, Naomi replied sharply, securing a pressure dressing over his ribs. And my shift isn't over. So, you aren't dying on my watch. Do you understand? A faint, blood-stained smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Naomi, he breathed, reading her hospital ID badge. I never forget a face. Naomi. He slipped into a coma just as the sound of heavy boots echoed in the corridor above. Naomi hid in the shadows for hours, monitoring his faint pulse until the NYPD finally secured the building at dawn. When the SWAT team eventually swept the basement, they found Naomi sitting exhausted against a wall, covered in blood. But the gurney was empty. Vincent's loyalists had infiltrated the hospital through the loading docks, bypassing the police perimeter to extract their boss while he was still unconscious. Detective Brian Gallagher interrogated Naomi for 8 straight hours. They knew who she had saved. They accused her of aiding a fugitive, threatening to strip her nursing license and throw her in Rikers Island. Naomi played the traumatized victim perfectly, claiming she had been taken hostage by armed men who stole the patient. But the fear of the NYPD was nothing compared to the paranoia of the underworld. Naomi knew she was a loose end. She had seen the face of the city's most elusive crime lord, and she knew his syndicate or his enemies would eventually come for her. 3 days later, Naomi Jefferson resigned from Bellevue, packed a single duffel bag, and vanished completely into the wind. 10 years is a lifetime in the criminal underworld. Regimes rise, cartels fall, and kings are buried under the concrete foundations of the city they once ruled. But Vincent Reynolds didn't fall. The night he nearly died in Bellevue hardened him into something entirely impenetrable. By the spring of 2026, he had eliminated his rivals, systematically dismantling the old Italian families and the Russian bratva, consolidating ultimate power from his impenetrable penthouse overlooking Central Park. He had everything: wealth that defied comprehension, political figures in his back pocket, and absolute fear from anyone who dared speak his name. Yet, for a decade, he possessed a singular, quiet obsession. He never forgot the black nurse with the steady hands and the fierce, uncompromising eyes. He had tasked his best fixers to find her, employing ex-FBI agents and private intelligence firms. But Naomi had been brilliant. She hadn't just moved. She had meticulously erased herself. She changed her name, worked entirely off the grid, and never filed taxes under the name Jefferson again. Vincent's patience finally snapped. Diagnosed with an incurable, slow-acting neurological condition that his private doctors predicted would claim his life in 5 years, he realized time was no longer a luxury he could afford. He didn't want to leave his empire to his ruthless lieutenants. He wanted to find the one person in the world who had looked at him not as a monster, but as a man worth saving. He wanted to give her everything. On an encrypted forum accessible only to elite information brokers and top-tier mercenaries, a post appeared under Vincent's verified cryptographic signature. It was simple, detailed, and devastatingly lucrative. Target: Naomi Jefferson, former ER nurse, Bellevue Hospital. African-American female, currently approx. 38 years old. Reward: $10 million USD for verified location and proof of life. Condition: she is not to be harmed. A single scratch on her will result in the immediate execution of the broker. Vincent thought the astronomical sum and the strict threat would guarantee a clean, professional extraction. He was dead wrong. The $10 million bounty didn't just mobilize private investigators. It set the entire criminal ecosystem on fire. The sheer size of the reward signaled to Vincent's remaining enemies that this woman was his ultimate weakness. If the untouchable Vincent Reynolds was willing to pay $10 million for a nurse, then possessing her meant holding the leash to his empire. Dominic Russo, the brutal young successor to a splintered Mafia faction operating out of New Jersey, saw an opportunity. We don't just find her for the bounty, Dominic told his enforcers in a smoke-filled room in Atlantic City. We find her, we take her, and we make Reynolds bleed his entire empire into our accounts to get her back. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in the quiet, snow-dusted town of Ithaca, New York, Naomi was living a painfully ordinary life. She now went by the name Sarah Jenkins. She had dyed her hair, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and managed a small, underfunded pediatric clinic. She lived in a modest cabin near Cayuga Lake, her past buried so deep she sometimes convinced herself the blood-soaked night at Bellevue was just a nightmare. But a $10 million bounty leaves no stone unturned. The digital dragnet, cast by the world's most dangerous hackers, began sifting through facial recognition databases, old DMV records, and security camera footage across the country. The fatal mistake came from an act of kindness. A week after the bounty was posted, a little boy at Naomi's clinic went into anaphylactic shock. The clinic's epinephrine auto-injectors were expired. Without hesitation, Naomi broke protocol, sprinting 3 blocks to a nearby pharmacy, demanding the medication and administering it right on the sidewalk. A bystander, impressed by her heroic, rapid response, recorded the incident on their smartphone and uploaded it to a local news blog. The algorithm caught it in less than 48 hours. The facial recognition software, running deep in a server farm in Eastern Europe, flagged a 94% match. The ping was intercepted by Robert Hastings, a disgraced former FBI profiler on Vincent's payroll. But Hastings wasn't the only one monitoring the dark web's tracking algorithms. Dominic Russo's cyber division caught the ping exactly 3 minutes later. In his Manhattan penthouse, Vincent was pouring a glass of scotch when his secure phone vibrated. It was Hastings. I found her, boss, Hastings said, his voice tight. Upstate, Ithaca. She's going by Sarah Jenkins. Vincent's hand tightened around the crystal glass. Send the extraction team. Polite, professional. Bring her to me. There's a problem, Vincent, Hastings interrupted, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. Our network was piggybacked. Russo's crew knows where she is, and based on the satellite tracking of their vehicles, they are already on the highway. They'll reach her clinic in less than 2 hours. Vincent slammed the glass down, shattering it into 100 pieces across the mahogany desk. The man who had spent 10 years trying to repay a life debt had just unwittingly placed a massive, inescapable target on her back. Get my helicopter ready, Vincent ordered his right-hand man, Arthur Pendleton, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal calm. And load the armory. If Russo's men touch a single hair on her head, I'm going to paint the snow in Ithaca red. Unaware of the private armies converging on her quiet town, Naomi locked the doors of the pediatric clinic, pulled her scarf tightly around her neck, and began her walk home in the fading evening light, stepping right into the crosshairs of a war she had tried for 10 years to escape. The biting wind whipping off Cayuga Lake felt like shards of glass against Naomi's cheeks as she hurried down State Street. The streetlights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the snow-banked sidewalks of Ithaca. She had walked this route hundreds of times over the past decade, lulled into a false sense of security by the sleepy, academic rhythm of the town. But tonight, the air felt suffocatingly heavy. Every crunch of her boots in the snow sounded too loud. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention, an old primal warning system she hadn't felt since that bloody night at Bellevue. As she turned the corner onto her quiet residential block, a sleek, black Lincoln Navigator, completely devoid of license plates, skidded to a halt at the intersection ahead, blocking the crosswalk. Before Naomi could pivot, 2 more heavy-duty SUVs boxed her in from behind, their high beams blinding her. The heavy doors slammed open, and 5 men stepped out into the freezing night. They wore tactical gear over heavy winter coats, their hands resting casually on the grips of suppressed submachine guns hanging from tactical slings. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle didn't wear a mask. Dominic Russo had a sharp, cruel face, ruined by a jagged scar that ran from his ear to his jawline. He took a drag from a cigarette, the cherry glowing fiercely in the dark, and exhaled a long plume of smoke into the frigid air. Naomi Jefferson, Dominic said, his voice a gravelly sneer. Or is it Sarah Jenkins now? Honestly, sweetheart, for 10 million bucks, I'd call you whatever you want. Naomi didn't waste time asking questions. The decade of peace hadn't dulled her survival instincts. It had only bottled them up. Dropping her heavy canvas tote bag, she violently hurled her metal thermos of scalding tea directly into the face of the nearest enforcer. As the man screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his blistered skin, Naomi bolted. She sprinted through a narrow alleyway separating 2 brick apartment buildings, vaulting over a chain-link fence with a desperate surge of adrenaline. Gunfire immediately shattered the quiet neighborhood. Suppressed rounds chewed through the wood and brick around her, spraying splinters into the snow. Don't kill her, Dominic roared from the street. Shoot her in the legs. The bounty is void if she's dead. Naomi scrambled up an icy fire escape, her breath tearing through her lungs like jagged metal. She knew she couldn't outrun them in the open. She needed cover. She kicked open the access window to an abandoned textile warehouse that abutted the alley, throwing herself into the pitch-black interior just as a bullet shattered the glass frame where her head had been a fraction of a second prior. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery and towering shelves of forgotten inventory. Naomi moved silently, utilizing her intimate knowledge of the town's industrial sector. She hid behind a massive steel loom, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the heavy boots of Russo's men kicking in the ground floor doors. Spread out! Find the nurse! Dominic commanded, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal ceiling. Reynolds is probably already on his way. I want her secured and in the trunk before that psycho gets here. Naomi pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle her breathing. She frantically searched her pockets, finding only her clinic keys and a small penlight. It wasn't enough to fight an armed hit squad. Suddenly, a deafening, rhythmic thudding shook the very foundation of the warehouse. The snow on the skylights blew away in a violent vortex. A matte black tactical helicopter descended over the building, its massive rotors whipping the winter storm into a blinding frenzy. Before the skids even touched the adjacent lot, the side doors slid open. Vincent's men didn't issue warnings. They descended like absolute wraiths. Laser sights cut through the dusty darkness of the warehouse windows, followed immediately by the devastating roar of high-caliber assault rifles. Russo's men were caught completely off guard. Two of them dropped instantly in the alleyway. Dominic shouted curses, diving behind a concrete pillar as the glass windows of the warehouse exploded inward. Through the chaos, a single figure walked calmly through the shattered loading dock doors. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. Vincent Reynolds wore a tailored black overcoat, a silk scarf, and an expression of pure, unadulterated murder. 10 years had aged him, his temples were dusted with silver, and he leaned slightly heavily on a custom steel-tipped cane, but the terrifying aura that surrounded him had only magnified. Russo, Vincent called out, his voice projecting effortlessly over the gunfire. You stepped out of your territory, and you touched something that belongs to me. Dominic fired blindly around the pillar. She belongs to whoever claims the bounty. You washed up old man. Vincent didn't flinch. He raised a customized handgun and fired 3 precise shots. The first shattered Dominic's knee. The second disarmed him. The third took the man standing next to Dominic squarely in the chest. Taking advantage of the distraction, Naomi crawled out from behind the loom, making a desperate break for the rear exit. But one of Russo's surviving men, desperate and bleeding, spotted her. He raised his weapon, aiming straight for her back. Vincent saw the movement. Without a second thought, the ruthless kingpin threw himself into the line of fire. The gunshot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Vincent took the bullet in his left shoulder, the impact spinning him around as he simultaneously returned fire, dropping the shooter permanently. Vincent hit the concrete floor hard, his cane clattering away into the dark. Silence descended on the warehouse, broken only by the howling wind and the groans of the dying. Arthur Pendleton, Vincent's impeccably dressed lieutenant, rushed through the doors with 4 heavily armed guards, securing the perimeter. Naomi froze at the back door. She looked at the bodies, the blood staining the concrete, and finally, at the man bleeding on the floor. It was Bellevue all over again. Against every logical instinct screaming at her to run, she turned around and walked back toward the gunfire. She knelt beside Vincent, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She pressed her scarf fiercely against his bleeding shoulder. Vincent looked up at her, a strained, bloody smile crossing his lips. Naomi, he rasped, coughing. I told you. I never forget a face. You are the most stubborn patient I have ever had, she snapped, though her hands were gentle as they applied pressure. Let's get you out of here before you bleed out on me again. They bypassed the local hospitals entirely. Naomi directed Arthur and the security team to a remote, off-the-grid hunting cabin owned by a friend of hers, hidden deep in the dense forests bordering the Finger Lakes. The blizzard had fully set in, burying their tracks and grounding the helicopter, trapping them in the wilderness. Inside the dimly lit cabin, the roaring fireplace provided the only warmth. Naomi had raided her emergency trauma kit, setting up a makeshift surgical station on the large oak dining table. Bullet passed clean through the deltoid. Missed the artery, but you need stitches and antibiotics immediately, Naomi stated clinically, cutting away Vincent's ruined coat and shirt. Vincent sat stoically, not making a sound as she irrigated the wound and began suturing the torn muscle. He watched her intently, analyzing the woman who had haunted his thoughts for a decade. She was older now, the youthful panic replaced by a hardened, quiet resilience. But she was still breathtakingly beautiful to him, her dark skin glowing in the firelight. I didn't put the bounty out to have you hunted, Vincent said quietly, breaking the silence. It was the only way to find you. The network. It got out of my control. $10 million puts a target on someone's back, Vincent. You brought a war to my doorstep, she replied, pulling a suture tight. Why? Why couldn't you just leave me be? Because I am dying, he stated simply. Naomi paused, the needle hovering in her hand. She looked at him, truly looking at him for the first time since the warehouse. His skin was pale, his pupils slightly dilated, and she noticed a faint, uncontrollable tremor in his right hand. My private doctors gave me 5 years, Vincent continued, his voice devoid of self-pity. A rare degenerative neurological disorder. My empire will tear itself apart when I fall. I have no family, no heirs. The 10 million wasn't a bounty, Naomi. It was an inheritance. I wanted to give it to the only person who ever saved me without asking for anything in return. Naomi frowned, her clinical mind racing. She grabbed her penlight, shining it sharply into his eyes. Follow the light, she commanded. She checked his reflexes, ran her fingers over his lymph nodes, and inspected his fingernails. Under the dirt and blood, she saw distinct, horizontal white lines spanning across his nail beds. Mies lines. This isn't a neurological disease, Naomi said, her voice dropping to a whisper, her medical intuition clicking into place. Vincent, you aren't dying of a genetic disorder. You are being poisoned. Vincent's eyes narrowed. What? Heavy metal toxicity, likely thallium, administered in microdoses over a long period. It mimics neurodegenerative diseases perfectly. It causes the tremors, the nerve pain, the organ failure. Someone close to you is slowly assassinating you. The heavy oak door of the cabin creaked open. Arthur Pendleton stood in the doorway, his custom suit dusting off the snow. His gun was drawn, and it was aimed directly at Vincent's chest. The rest of the security detail was nowhere to be seen. She really is a brilliant nurse, Arthur said, stepping into the room, locking the deadbolt behind him. I paid those private doctors a fortune to fabricate those charts, and she unravels it in 5 minutes in a wooden shack. Vincent didn't move, his expression turning into a mask of pure ice. Arthur, you. 10 years, Vincent. I built this syndicate with you, Arthur sneered, pacing the room. But you were perfectly willing to hand the keys to the kingdom and 10 million in untraceable cash to a ghost. I couldn't let you do that. Once I put the bounty out on the dark web, I knew Russo would try to claim it. I was going to let him kill you both tonight and take over as the grieving successor. You always were impatient, Arthur, Vincent said softly. And you were always too sentimental, Arthur replied, raising the gun towards Naomi. Say goodbye to your guardian angel. Naomi didn't freeze. As Arthur shifted his aim toward her, she snatched the scalpel from the table and hurled it with lethal precision. It didn't hit Arthur, but it struck the heavy iron fireplace poker, leaning against the stone hearth, knocking it clattering loudly to the floor. The split-second distraction was all Vincent needed. Despite the agonizing pain in his shoulder and the poison ravaging his nerves, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. He slammed his body weight into Arthur, driving the traitor through the brittle wooden coffee table. The gun discharged wildly, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. Vincent pinned Arthur to the floor, his forearm pressing brutally against his former lieutenant's throat, cutting off his air supply until Arthur's struggles ceased entirely. Vincent stood up slowly, breathing heavily, leaning against the wall for support. He looked at Arthur's unconscious body, then turned to Naomi. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rough. I've had better Tuesday nights, Naomi breathed out, dropping back into a chair, her hands shaking as the adrenaline finally crashed. By morning, Vincent's remaining loyalists, the ones not on Arthur's payroll, arrived to clean up the mess. Arthur was hauled away, destined for a very dark, very deep hole. Vincent stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered trees in brilliant shades of gold and pink. He turned to Naomi, pulling a thick, black envelope from his coat pocket. He placed it on the table. The account numbers, the routing codes, the encrypted keys. $10 million, Vincent said. Clean, untraceable, and a new identity crafted by the best forgers in Europe. You can go anywhere in the world, Naomi. No one will ever look for you again. The bounty is officially closed. Naomi looked at the envelope. It represented everything she had run from, and everything that could set her free. She picked it up, feeling its heavy weight in her hands. Then, calmly, she tossed it directly into the roaring fireplace. Vincent stepped forward in shock as the flames consumed the paper. What are you doing? I spent years running from ghosts, Vincent, Naomi said, stepping closer to him, her dark eyes locking onto his. I hid my name. I hid my life. And in the end, it still caught up to me. I'm done running. She reached up, gently touching the uninjured side of his face. Thallium poisoning requires extensive chelation therapy. It will take months of agonizing treatment to flush it from your system. You'll need a very good, very expensive private nurse. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across the mob boss's hardened features, reaching his dark eyes for the first time in a decade. And what is your asking price, Nurse Jefferson? Everything, she whispered, pulling him down by the lapels of his coat. I want everything. What an explosive ending. If you loved this intense story of betrayal, survival, and unexpected romance, hit that like button and share this video with your fellow drama lovers. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a thrilling tale. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept the $10 million?